Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I was going to talk just a little bit, few seconds about these pictures. This lady lived up in Northwest Allen. They were about where the Terrell Center, Recreation Center is. That was their place. She was part of the Bush family, and they immigrated from the Daniel Boone colony in Boonesboro, Kentucky, and she was 16 years old when she came to Allen and was wrote the only known diary. And getting stuck and flooding were the biggest challenges that they had, and because they'd get stuck in the mud, and that was when she was a younger. And they still got stuck. So I'm old enough to remember when I'd be out in the grandparents' place and you'd hear the rumor going around town that the bridge was out over on such and such creek and you had to go around such and such. And that was a common thing even in the 60s. Anyways, this lady in 1849, can you stop it here, Aaron, on this picture? She and Pete Ford are reportedly the earliest Anglo pioneers to Allen. And one reason I wanted to stop here, in 1849, her husband, George Washington Ford, and both, by the way, they are buried at the Allen Cemetery, he hears about the California Gold Rush and rushes out there to be with the gold rush. And of course, like 90% of them doesn't find anything and loses all of his money and comes back penniless. He was gone 1 year. She had small children. Can you imagine husbands leaving today with their wives with small children? The wife would say, "Don't come back." And another interesting part of her story, she and Pete, they called him Wash Ford. In 1844, they immigrated into the Allen area. Their place was near Bethany, where the Bethany Joe Farmer Recreation Center is. And they decided to homestead that area. The people they were with went just a little bit further west towards Jupiter and Rowlett Creek. And then some people that they were with went down a little bit further to where the Central Expressway crosses 75. Well, they were supposed to go to McKinney to get supplies one morning, and they never showed up. And her husband went down to check on them, and they had been killed probably by Comanches. And it was the last known Native American dispute. I call it dispute, collision of cultures, in Allen, Texas. There were no other subsequent conflicts after that time, but that was in 1844. And she and her husband, if they had migrated just a half mile further, they might have been caught in the attack too. But they decided they wanted that particular homestead. And at one time, they owned about 2,000 acres. The Ford Middle School is on that homestead. So anyway, she is probably the earliest, that I can find, earliest Anglo settler. And so we can call her the mother of modern Allen. So how's that for starting our tonight's story? Dr. Caughfield came here about a year ago to talk about General Walker. And that video has attracted 142,000 people watching it. So I hope this presentation garners as much attention. So she's graduate, did her PhD at TCU, and we're so happy to have her, Dr. Adrienne Caughfield. And after her presentation, we'll have a short moderation and take questions from the audience.
Thank you, and good evening. I want to thank you, first of all, for coming, for taking time out on a Thursday evening to come and listen to me and learn a little bit of history and kind of work with it together with me. I also want to thank Tom and the Allen Public Library for the opportunity to come out here and speak. But I am looking forward to this evening, sharing a little bit from the book that he pointed out, True Women and Westward Expansion, Texas A&M Press. It's been out for a long time now, but I still like being able to talk about it. This was based on my dissertation from Texas Christian, and it's a topic that I think is kind of fascinating, and I'm looking forward to kind of sharing that with you. So to start off, here we go. I mean, typically, when we think of Texas history, there are certain names that kind of come to mind. Stephen F. Austin is a good example, Sam Houston, William Barrett Travis. But how about people like, say, Mary Austin Holley, or Margaret Houston, or Juana Navarro Ellsbury? Some of these names might be more familiar than others, but they are no less a part of the story of Texas. Each in her own way, the people I mentioned, contributed to what Texas would eventually become. So you have different roles that women would play. It's going to look a little different from, say, looking at Stephen F. Austin or Sam Houston, but they were no less important. So I'm going to be talking about how women were really basically crucial and seen as being crucial in transplanting some of that basically Anglo-American culture into Texas in the early 19th century and what that actually ended up looking like. So to start off, to make sure we're all on the same page, I need to give a little bit of background to kind of define some terms and explain how women were perceived. First place I'm going to start is with the concept of manifest destiny, which they're going to be playing into. Now, manifest destiny is a term that you hear fairly frequently, and just to give a little bit of background for those who are less familiar with it, it actually came from an article that was in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, published in July 1845. There was an article called Annexation, dealing with the after effects of the annexation of Texas and looking ahead to what could come next. And it was there that the phrase was first used. And to kind of give you an idea, what it said was, it was talking about the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So you can hear manifest destiny sticking out there. Now, first thing I'm going to do is a little bit of an aside, and I'll do this a couple of times. Typically, when people refer to this article and to the idea of the development of manifest destiny, they all refer to the editor of the Democratic Review, a man by the name of John O'Sullivan. However, and this is, I think, pertinent to where we're going tonight, there has been a suggestion by an author in a different book suggesting that the language used in the article does not sound like O'Sullivan at all. Who does it sound like? A woman from Texas named Jane McManus Storm Casno. And so it's been suggested that she actually came up with the concept of manifest destiny and ran with it. So much so that eventually by the 1850s, she became better known for other things. First of all, championing the growth and expansion of Texas, but also considering the expansion of the United States in other directions. For example, Cuba, which we may talk about later. But again, that's just an aside. The idea of manifest destiny, though, what does it actually mean? I mean, the sentence sounded interesting, but let's unpack it a little bit. What it's basically saying is that there was a God-given right for Americans to expand their ideals and their influence across the continent, and not just for Americans who were in the process of moving west, but also for the people who were already there to begin with, so they could also reap the same benefits. That's the concept of manifest destiny. And you can see it a little bit if you look at the painting that I have up there in large scale. It was painted in 1872, but the idea is basically the same. A man named John Gast painted American Progress. And there are all sorts of interesting details to this, and I try to inflict this on my students and say, okay, what details do you see? Where do you go? But all the way, if you can just barely see in the background, to the right or to the east, you have civilization, where you have boats in the harbor, bridges, and then, of course, the locomotives making their way to the west, along with prospectors and people with covered wagons, and, of course, moving out of the way to make room for these new individuals, you have the various forms of wildlife, the bison, the bears, the Native Americans, who would have been seen in about that same light, moving out of the way to make way for the light of American progress. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about manifest destiny. It's this theme of a very distinct form of culture, something that is, first of all, Anglo-Saxon, democratic, Republican, not partisan, but that this is a democratic republic, Protestant, and all of that tied together to create a superior culture that had the responsibility and also the right to be able to move into these areas and spread out from there and put this necessary influence over the vast wilderness that you see here. So when we're talking about manifest destiny, that's the idea behind it. It's not just the expansion, it's the ideology behind the expansion that kind of ties it together. Now, the one thing you'll of course notice is in the center of the picture, I haven't mentioned her yet, the ultimate symbol of progress is a woman, bringing the telegraph wires with her, carrying a book with all sorts of necessary knowledge, all of this demonstrating this as a symbol of civilization in a wild world. And this kind of ties into the idea of what is, in essence, true womanhood. Sometimes it's called the cult of true womanhood. Sometimes it's called the cult of domesticity. Basically what it is the ideology that Americans had in this time period to kind of look at how women were going to be perceived. And they were perceived and lauded, frankly, as being superior vessels of the civilized ideal. It was an idea in the early 1800s that women had the ability, because they were able to be above business and politics and all that messy junk, they were seen as morally superior. And as such, they were vessels of carrying that information from as early as the early Republic, after the American Revolution, where women were perceived as being the best way to train children up to become good, solid Republican citizens. And this just expanded in the early 1800s. So it wasn't just, what they were doing was, women's work was not necessarily just making it possible, but being a good influence and even being an inspiration. I mean, if you look at early American pictures, a lot of them, it shows the Republic as being, again, a woman, a shining example. But it was described, the quote I have up here is from a magazine called Blackwoods, kind of explaining things a little bit, that women were, as they put it, not to make laws, not to lead armies, not to govern empires, but to form those by whom laws are made and armies led and empires governed. And that, in many ways, was seen as the superior job. So there's a major undercurrent of this idea of true womanhood beneath the development of American culture and civilization in Texas and elsewhere, and women are just inextricably part of that. So the idea of having that kind of influence is generally the expected form of women's contributions to society, but in Texas, well, Texas, of course, is different. We can see a little bit more involvement than this, and not always necessarily in quite the ways they would have expected at the time. I mean, coming to a new land with new circumstances, and sometimes, that's going to require some bold steps. And you can kind of see this from the beginning with the first arrival of Anglo-Americans in Texas while it was still part of the Spanish Empire. So starting off at 1819, where they were still in the thick of the Mexican Revolution. Mexico was still trying to break free from Spanish control. And at the same time, Spain had been trying to negotiate a treaty, either called the Adams-Onis Treaty or the Transcontinental Treaty, that basically the United States gave up any claim to Texas as being part of the Louisiana Purchase. And all this happened at the same time. Lots of upheaval, but there were plenty of Americans who weren't really sure that was exactly what should have been. Texas should be part of the Louisiana Territory. That's just how it works. So you had a man by the name of James Long coming out of Natchez, Mississippi, who joined up with a friend of his named Jose Felix Tras Palacios. And their goal was to try to wrest control of Mexico from the Spanish, and did so by moving to the area in 1820. And James did that along with his pregnant wife, Jane, his 4-year-old daughter, Anne, and their enslaved woman, Cayenne, or sometimes she's called Cayamatia or Cayamatia, which leads to kind of another aside here, because a lot of times people recognize the name Jane Long, they are less familiar with Cayenne, even though she was no less a part of what was happening in Texas in that time period. So she has as much to do with the progress as Jane does, so I'm going to bring her up. But it's important to recognize at this point that a lot of what we're seeing as you see Anglo-Americans moving into Texas, a lot of them are going to be from southern states and bring southern culture with them, so much so that slavery is going to be seen as a major part of the idea of expansion. Now, that being said, there will be plenty of examples of black women who I could bring up who did act independently in Texas and put forth their own influence in their own ways. People like Tamar Morgan Hardin, Sylvia Puss Weber, or one who's probably better known, but usually by a different name, Emily D. West. But at this point, it was pretty much Jane Long and Cayenne and Anne trying to make their way in a territory in the Bolivar Peninsula, not too far from Galveston, that was, frankly, Karankawa territory. And the Karankawa were notorious. They were known potentially as cannibals. Nobody was sure how accurate that was, but nobody necessarily wanted to find out. And there she was by herself with her family all around them, and who knows what's not going on outside. So Jane and Cayenne spent a lot of their time using the cannon that they managed to procure in the fort that James had built and shot it off occasionally, just to make sure people knew that they were actually still there. And then kind of fended for themselves as best as they could. Cayenne apparently went out several times to gather food, and when she did so, to make sure that she wasn't an even bigger target than she already was for not being Karankawa, she would dress like a man. In a way, kind of hiding femininity and potentially perceived vulnerability. And that way they managed to survive for a while until eventually Jane Long did get word that her husband had been captured by the Spanish, taken, held captive for about 6 months, and then executed. Eventually, as time went on, as more people started coming to Texas and settling, she became one of the better known figures in the area. Ran a boarding house, became a public figure, eventually a landholder, and a lot of people even today still think of her as kind of the mother of Texas because of what happened here. I could argue that she and Cayenne both could be technically mothers of Texas, looking at how they set this tone for later, establishing a foothold by way of a consistent, assertive presence, and seeing what they're going with from there. Now, Jane Long is just one example of a lot of different Anglo-American arrivals as Mexico became independent and as Mexico started to try to establish itself to kind of increase its security, defending its interests. They started practicing something that's basically called defensive immigration. The more people you have in Texas, the safer it is from these crazy, ambitious Americans who are really interested in our territory. Now, it's somewhat ironic that they would go to the United States to ask for these immigrants at the same time, but that's pretty much what happened by using the impresario system. But the thing is, as these people were moving in, purchasing land grants, settling down, a lot of them were looking for a fresh start in a new land, but they were also packing with them some assumptions and expectations that they were planning on following through with once they got there. Now, one of these assumptions is the idea that is tied into expansion to a point, the idea that you're taming the wilderness by way of agriculture. These people are farmers. This was integral to understanding expansion. The idea was land is meant to be used. If you are not cultivating it, you are not reaching its fullest potential, and that is part of what you are attempting to do. American farmers were going to be a major part of that. To kind of give you an idea, I mentioned Jane Casno. She described it this way: if a healthy man is poor and homeless in Texas, it's because he's not manly enough to turn his hands to useful labor. And she said it fairly bluntly. Other people were a little bit gentler. Later on, there were German immigrants, such as a woman named Ottilie Goethe, who talked to her friends about how the earth was virtually begging for a hand to cultivate it. It's just right there. It's there for the taking. So stewardship of the earth, of course, means putting it to use for the benefit of everybody. So the best known example of this, of course, is going to be Stephen F. Austin, one of the first impresarios, actually taking the mantle from his late father, Moses. We know about how he managed to get a couple of different land grants and serve as impresario for both of them, establishing Austin's colony, becoming a fairly big public figure. Less known would be his cousin, whose picture you see there. That would be Mary Austin Holley, who was originally from Connecticut, eventually moved with her husband Horace to Lexington, Kentucky, where she lived, raised 2 children until her husband died. And in that time period, not long after that, she received word from some of her relatives in the Austin colony to come and visit. Go relax a little bit, see how things are going there. And so she went and visited in 1831, and that was when she ran back into Stephen F. Austin, and apparently the two really hit it off, had a wonderful time hanging out and talking about ideas and et cetera. But from there, she was so motivated by what Austin was doing that she wanted to help. And the way she chose to do this was to write a book that was published later, 1831, called Texas, an Immigrants' Guide. Now, what an immigrant guide is something you would see even, well, throughout the 19th century, this basically talking about why to go to a new location, how to get there, what to expect, what you should bring with you, all these different things. It's a very practical sort of thing. And in this book, Holley just waxed rhapsodic about the beauties of Texas, as she called it, the salubrity of the climate. I like the term salubrity. The fertility of the soil and the facility with which the lands can be brought under cultivation. All of this talking about how lovely it is, the flora, the fauna, everything like that, but with an eye, of course, to how to utilize it best. And that, of course, is the ultimate goal. Now, not that everything, of course, was perfect. She also spent a good deal of time talking about how mosquitoes and what she called red bugs, what we frequently call chiggers, were absolutely evil. And I'd have to agree with her on that. But, at least she's trying to be honest. You don't want to surprise anybody with any of this when they show up. But she said it was only a matter of time before Texas was going to be just as settled and civilized as any other part of the continent that they would have been familiar with. By that point, it was just a matter of time before they managed to come up with reasonable roads, for instance. Brazoria in Austin Colony was about 3 years old when she was able to check it out. And she pointed out it had already had, as she put it, some families of education and refinement, because we're always pointing towards that end. And while the houses were, of course, rough because you only have so many supplies, at least they were kept, as she put it, in perfect neatness. Which, of course, being the point that, life was hard, but progress was being made. The best of a bad situation was being made at the hands of earnest and busy housewives, which in her mind, of course, was a good thing. Now, adding to that, this immigrant guide talked about all sorts of elements that Texas had to offer, but she also was a little bit unique. Most immigrant guides didn't aim at women. They aimed at the husbands, the ones who made the decision to go to Texas or California or wherever else. She was looking at the women because they needed to be prepared for what they were going to get. Case in point, the idea, and she pointed this out, that once you move there, you might as well bring everything you need with you because otherwise, once you get there, it's going to be at least 2 or 3 years before you can get anything else new, if you're lucky. And that was being, somewhat optimistic. It wasn't on the forefront of her mind, but there it was. But there were other people who were kind of looking at the same way. There was a woman named Mary Helm who wrote about her experiences, talked about, why worry about fashion or the latest improvements in cooking when life is already hard, one thing at a time. There was another woman who later in her, as an older lady, wrote her memoirs. She was about 8 years old in 1833, talked about how she remembered, as she put it, no church, no preacher, schoolhouse, nor courthouse, nothing familiar. Or, as a later example, in the 1840s, a woman named Helen Chapman who came with her husband from Massachusetts when he was stationed at Fort Brown, aka Brownsville, after the Mexican War. She looked at the area of South Texas and she was just much more frank than anybody else. She said, for such a country as this, why expend such blood and treasure? So this is what they were starting with. Mostly what you're seeing is a rough, empty wilderness, or at least almost empty. It depended on who you're looking at. What about the Native Americans? Well, to give you an idea, another woman, Harriet Ames, who wrote in her diary this: there are no neighbors but the Indians. I don't see anyone living here. What are we going to do without neighbors? Now, does that mean Indians didn't count? Well, apparently not for her, but these are people who were living in Texas at the time, and most women, when they moved into the area, found themselves generally making do as best as they possibly could, often even serving as kind of agents of trade, as the public face, trading or swapping with people coming in from various tribes with food and other things that they might potentially need. It was largely friendly-ish, maybe a little bit strained from time to time. Case in point, in one German town later on in the 1800s, they invited a band of Comanche to a town supper. They came in, graciously accepted the offer, started eating the food with their hands, which was somewhat off-putting. What was more off-putting was when their guests suddenly realized there was a dead horse around the corner and decided to use that for dessert. So learning how to negotiate this sort of thing was going to be complicated at best. But really, more often than not, even though you had these relationships, and they did the best they could with those, a lot of Anglo women tended to look at Native American tribes more with fear and concern because of the potential, abductions and other forms of brutality. Case in point, the story of 16-year-old Matilda Lockhart. In San Antonio in 1840, a number of Comanche chieftains came in offering to do a hostage exchange so they could get some of their own people and return some captives in return. And eventually, one of the people they returned was Matilda Lockhart. Now, according to the story, which we are unable to verify, she came back in kind of a miserable state. Apparently, they had burned the soles of her feet so she couldn't escape. And according to some reports, at least, they'd burned off her nose. The anger that resulted because of something like this would eventually lead to what became known as the Council House fight, which was a particularly messy battle between the people of San Antonio and the Comanche. But by and large, what this meant was a lot of Texans are going to be looking at Indians basically as part of the wilderness that need to be either tamed or simply removed. For example, one Comanche woman who was taken captive was not given the same benefit of the doubt that, say, Anglo women might have. She was perceived as savage, lacking in femininity, lacking in just basic human decency. So a lot of this would just kind of reinforce the general impression a lot of Texans have and their efforts to rid the land of the perceived problem of the Comanche or the Apache or the Kiowa or the Wichita or others. But of course there were exceptions. Probably the best known and the most striking is going to be the woman whose picture you see on the right, and that would be Cynthia Ann Parker. Parker was 8 or 9 years old or so in 1836 when the Comanche attacked Parker's fort, killing most of the adults, taking away several people as captives, including Cynthia Ann. As time went on, they actually adopted her into the Comanche tribe. She was raised that way, eventually married a Comanche man, had 3 children, the most famous of whom turned out to be Quanah Parker, who was probably one of the best known Comanches even now. But what happened was in 1860, eventually she was discovered by rangers led by a guy named Lawrence Sul Ross, who figured out eventually who she was and decided the best course of action would be to remove her from her captivity and take her back to her family that was waiting back in East Texas. This was not her idea. She had just lost her family, left behind when she was dragged into East Texas. She actually tried to escape, go back. It didn't work. She ended up staying in East Texas pretty much for the rest of her life, but died in 1871 of flu that was apparently aggravated by basically starving herself for missing her family. This kind of flies in the face of the standard narrative in a way, and they weren't exactly sure what to do with that, but eventually over time what you start seeing, of course, is the tribes being slowly pushed into decline due to environmental changes, geopolitical changes, hostilities, being moved to Oklahoma. After that, the question becomes significantly less prevalent. But that's only one issue that they were dealing with. You also had the increasing tension over time between Texans or Texians or Texicans, all those terms were used, and the Mexican government, especially due to political differences. Mexico was a republic. It was not quite like the republic they had left behind in the United States for a variety of reasons, and that sometimes led to some potentially violent misunderstandings, such as, say, the Battle of Velasco in 1832. This was kind of an extension of what had started on the coastline a little bit upwards, a place called Anahuac, and it was kind of pushback against the idea that the military could have any sort of control over civilians, and it developed eventually into the Battle of Velasco in an attempt to kind of secure cannons to protect themselves at Anahuac. But in the midst of all this, there was a woman named Anne Rainey Coleman who decided to do her part by spending a lot of time by her fireside, molding bullets for her family and friends. This is not unusual for the time. A lot of women would do this. Now, they might not have done what she did next. What she did was then take the ammunition, go out into the battlefield, leave it in the hollow of a tree, and hope that they could find it there. And apparently on the way back, she said that she had been followed by a couple of Mexican spies, and she managed to make it back with her life, but it was a bit of a harrowing incident. That's a little bit different from just simply exercising a beneficent influence over your culture. This is handing them weaponry, basically. And a lot of other women did the same as things got more tense, and it led, of course, to the Texas Revolution, where women would mold more bullets, and sew banners that could be taken into battle, sewing uniforms, raising money, writing beautiful poetry, lauding the efforts of the Texans in their attempt to push for independence. And of all else, I mean, they're trying to best to be prepared. For example, Mary Austin Holley. She did a couple of things. First of all, she wanted to make sure she was ready, because when the Mexican army came through, you didn't want to be left undefended. So she and her friends actually spent some time learning how to shoot a rifle in her backyard to make sure that they knew how to aim. Now, apparently she split a clothesline. I don't know if she would ever have hit anything beyond that. She didn't say, but she was going to be prepared whether or not anything happened. She also reissued her work on Texas in 1836. Along with it, she included all sorts of documents, including the Texas Declaration of Independence, other things like that, talking about all the things that had happened in Texas up until that point. And the whole idea, what she was trying to do is have this sold back in Kentucky where they could find out about it and she could raise some money to send back to Texas from there for what she called the Holy Cause of Texas. So she was a fundraiser. Now, on top of that, you do also have the idea of women being used as a symbol for the war effort, too. There's a reason why you fight. It kind of reminds me of Mulan, you know, a girl worth fighting for. That's kind of what you see here. After things kind of broke, the San Felipe de Austin Telegraph and Texas Register actually put together an editorial talking about how women had done so much. They'd provided intelligence, all sorts of things. And they were using that as an example to urge men to take up their arms to defend these women and, as they put it, helpless, innocent children. And they compared the example of the women to these backward men, and that's directly quoted from the article, who couldn't be bothered to defend their own families. Women can do it, why can't you? So again, they became that example of what should be going on. They're meant to be a contrast to spur men to be men, basically, insofar as they were defined in this context. And of course, sometimes they were a little bit closer to the action than others. The Alamo, of course, is a perfect example of all this. Did they fight? No. But they were witnesses to and participants in events. The best known is the woman whose picture you see on the left, Susanna Dickinson. She and her daughter Angelina are probably the best known survivors of the Alamo. But there were other people present, such as the woman I mentioned before, Juana Navarro Alsbury. She actually came from, in a sense, somebody who was becoming quite prominent at the time. Her uncle was a man named Jose Antonio Navarro. You know, Navarro County, it's named after him. He was a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence and well known as a Texas patriot. She was also cousin to Jim Bowie's late wife, Ursula Veramendi. And she was actually with Jim Bowie in the Alamo. You know, the story is, and we know this story, that how he got sick and was laying in his sickbed at the Alamo. She was his nurse, tending to him while all of this was happening. Now, she would tell the story later of what happened, how William Barrett Travis came to her and said, you speak Spanish, you can come and be in you speak for us, and he sent her to Santa Ana to try to negotiate. And she said once she got there, he basically ignored her because she was just a woman, and why would he pay attention to her? So the mission was a failure. She did return to the Alamo just in time to be there when the battle actually broke on March 6th. And it was then that she went into hiding. She hid her son, who she put in a dress to try to disguise the fact that this was an infant boy, along with her sister, whose picture is on the right. Get her through this. And they were kind of hiding inside the Alamo along with other people. She actually watched a couple of men basically be cut down in front of her, trying to defend her and her son and her sister. But we don't usually hear about that story. We also don't hear what happened after the Alamo. Once the revolution ended, Susanna Dickinson talked about how what Aylesbury had done was slipped out to the Mexicans, giving away the numbers of the people who were in the Alamo, spying for Mexico. Whereas Aylesbury herself said, no, that's not what happened at all. William Barrett Travis sent me. But the fact that Dickinson actually accused her like that was not going to be terribly unusual in what happened after the Texas Revolution, when suddenly politics was not the primary difference between those who were Anglo and those who were Tejano. And what you see over time is it was increased racial hostility and suspicion, which would just be continually exacerbated over the next several years, thanks in part to several attempted invasions by Mexico, eventually leading into the Mexican War, and far beyond. I mean, this is just part of Texas history. It is at that point where you had women like, say, Mary Helm, who argued that Tejanos were, as she put it, semi-barbarous, as she put it also, the debris of several inferior and degraded races. Not to mention the various religious differences between those who were Protestant and Hispanics who were Catholic that just kind of reinforced the same type of assumptions in the minds of many Anglos at this time period. And this would eventually help to justify further expansion, because the idea was those who were Hispanic were not capable of achieving the same level of civilization. And the words of Helm and others just simply, they believed, reinforced that and pushed it from there. But if you look at it, looking at people like Aylesbury, at her sister, and at others, I mean, Texas was never homogenous, ever, nor were its efforts at independence. This is a point that is either sidelined or just simply frequently forgotten. So besides that, I mean, there's all sorts of big events, of course, happening in Texas, but you also have that idea I mentioned before, that women are influential in making sure that civilization is achieved in people's behavior and how they respond. And Margaret Houston is a perfect case in point of this. Margaret Houston is the second wife of Sam Houston. His first wife, who was Cherokee, had died. Eventually, he spent a lot of time drowning his sorrows, so much so that the Cherokee people later referred to him loosely as Big Drunk. Made his way to Texas from there. And what happened was she eventually found him. They got married. But the thing about Margaret Houston was she was a temperance advocate, which is to say she, along with many other women in Texas and the United States eventually later on, encouraged giving up alcohol as being detrimental to civilization, as detrimental to society. And what Margaret Houston was able to do is work towards his baptism into the Baptist Church, first of all in 1854, and along with that, his abstention from alcohol, which for her would have been a pretty major coup. And it was not unusual for the time. You have a lot of women in Texas and elsewhere pushing for this sort of thing to make sure that the highest levels of civilization are attainable. Case in point, similar to this, you had some women in 1855 who were referred to in a newspaper as the Kaufman Girls. And the Kaufman Girls basically raided a grocery store in town, proceeded to find the barrels of alcohol, ran them out into the street and broke them. Made their point pretty clearly. Similarly, you have Helen Chapman, the one who ended up at Fort Brown. When she went there, she was somewhat disconcerted by the fact that this was a military town. She was worried about the billiard parlors, the gambling tables, the drinking shop. She wanted to put a stop to all of this and move towards a more civilized society, Texas as part of the United States. And she was certainly not afraid of sharing her thoughts. One time there was a judge who she happened to pass in the street who pointed out the brand new courthouse, and isn't it grand? And her response, as she described it later, was, "But where are you going to get a handsome Protestant church, Judge? You know a city can't pretend to much respectability without churches and schools. So she was going to push for that and put herself into the public arena, which is not typically where true womanhood says you should be. Where do you have your best influence? In the home. What did she do? She founded Brownsville's first Sunday school, 70 students, half of whom were Hispanic. As she put it, the quote up there is hers: "The moral influence of women cannot be overrated." And so in the minds of many Americans, both men and women, women were seen as foundational in a way to establishing American republicanism in a very rough country, as well as eventually encouraging even greater expansion beyond that. You had people saying, well, we've already gotten, say, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo led to the Mexican Cession, leading to a significant portion of the United States being attached. They said, why not take the rest of Mexico? There was actually an all-Mexico movement that a lot of women in Texas supported. Or what about Cuba? Jane Casno in the 1850s, at that point, expansion wasn't just expansion for expansion's sake. It had a distinct Southern flavor to it. You're expanding to increase what they called, at the time, an empire for slavery. Cuba would be perfect for that. Slavery already existed there. It's right off the coast of Florida. Let's go. So this is the kind of thing that they would help to encourage. Women were no less a part of that than they were anything else. Now, all of these things combined, both in wartime and in peacetime, really they couldn't have helped but increase a lot of Texas women's sense of self. What are we capable of? It gave them more influence than one might normally have expected of women in the mid-19th century. I mean, after all, they perceived it as their responsibility. They perceived it as their right. So much so that eventually the lady on the right, Leucadia Pease, she's the governor's wife. She described herself as a woman's rights woman in a time period where a lot of people looked at that and said, you want to do what now? But it seemed to make sense at the time. Now, the thing is, more often than not, that kind of ambition was emerging in a kind of environment where there were going to be significant limitations just because of the nature of how women's roles were perceived. So much so that the woman on the left, Elizabeth Scott Neblett, once wrote kind of despairingly in her diary about it. She said, I can never gain worldly honor. Fame can never be mine. I am a woman, a woman. I can hardly teach my heart to be content with my life. But one of the greatest motivators to action, I think, sometimes can be frustration and obstacles. And you definitely see it, not just in Texas, but elsewhere. And a lot of the opportunities that women had taken in Texas up until this point, being a part of the big story that is Texas history, was only going to feed that sense of capability and that call to action, whether it was just outright stated or not. Of course, that would be in times to come, which I'm not talking about tonight. Thank you.
We'll have a few minutes of conversation, then we'll take questions from the audience. One of the first questions I wanted, when I've read your book, first of all, you said it was your PhD dissertation. It was one of the only dissertations I've been able to read. All the others are unreadable. So thank you for that dissertation.
Thank you.
One of the first facts that kind of jumped out at me was the Ann Coleman. She went into more detail in her book, but this woman did some very dangerous, and my impression of the women's role in both the 1830s and 40s was basically doing the domestic work so the men could be out in the field. But she definitely was more than that. She was assuming some dangerous work. Care to elaborate?
I don't know, I kind of hit it on the head there. A lot of women were putting themselves into harm's way in this time period because you only have so many people upon whom you could rely. Frankly, there were limited opportunities, but lots of tension, lots of potential danger, and you just kind of have to suck it up and go with it. And you may not realize until years later that you've actually done something almost historical, but that was just how you had to survive in this time period. And they were so insistent upon this being a part of who they were, that they were helping to build Texas or build it into an image that they were familiar with, and they're willing to take whatever steps it took in that kind of situation.
Mrs. Pease, one of the things that I get Governor Pease is recognized as being one of the early governors who started bringing schools to Texas and providing the funding and so forth for education. And he was always recognized in Texas history as being the first governor who really said we need to have schools. Well, now after reading your book, I thought, I think his wife had some influence over that. Why wasn't she recognized? Can you elaborate on that?
In that time period, why would she be recognized? I mean, it's the kind of the old cliche, the power behind the throne, if you will. And you kind of see that where women were definitely not in the public spotlight. That was not their place. You definitely have this concept where you have different spheres of influence, where men are in the public sphere. They're in business, they're in politics, they're in warfare. And women, their role is in the home and building a solid foundation upon which to have business and politics and what have you. But it's meant to be more of a silent position. So I don't think Leucadia was all that unusual, except that she actually had a voice just simply because she was the governor's wife, that she could actually say this and find it, make its way into print somewhere. But this is something that's fairly typical. I mean, you could even argue this, but men and women generally, a lot of people do a lot of work not seeking the spotlight. They're unsung heroes. It's just that given the circumstances, she would have had even fewer opportunities to be recognized for that than men in that period. But she's not the only example. All sorts of women were getting deeply involved in education, certainly. One of the reasons they didn't have specifically college for women. In fact, most people didn't go to college at all, but they did have what they called sometimes women's seminaries to kind of at least get them educated enough so that they could then, in turn, teach the next generation. And it was seen as their role, and it had been for several decades. Now, a lot of these seminaries included fantastic fields of study, as say embroidery, cooking, sewing, but also, basic literacy, awareness of your civilization and your history, to be able to share this with other people. And while a lot of the early teachers were men, plenty of them were also women who, until they got married, had an opportunity to exercise that. And so any opportunity they had to do that, they would.
I also didn't realize the importance of Keon till I read your book, to this whole movement. I just thought that was a wonderful story. What kind of details or documents were you able to uncover that were there but nobody else really had touched them?
Honestly, I'm not sure I ever found anything in my studying to get towards my dissertation that hadn't been seen before, because a lot of this stuff was already published. Had it been used, that's a different story.
Tell us
tell
us how you made a difference.
Well, the most honest answer to start off with is I needed a topic for my dissertation. But the thing is, I was always fascinated with the idea of expansion and the ideology behind that. And I recognized, I'd already done, my master's thesis was actually looking at women who were moving west and their views on their situation. And so I took that idea and said, well, let me just kind of bring that in. But there's some fantastic manuscript evidence in Texas. We have really, really good records in all sorts of places. I probably could have kept researching for years if I hadn't realized I needed to finish at some point in my life. So I kind of narrowed it down just for that reason alone, and just for time reasons. But there's some fantastic stuff out there. Some of the stuff I mentioned in there is better known than others. A lot of this stuff has already been published, and you can find it floating around. You can find it at half-price books. Other things, a lot of the, there were several documents that were actually at the DeGolyer Library in kind of loose manuscript form through the Texas State Library down in Austin. Again, they've been there for a while, but nobody, as far as I was aware, had ever really gone through any of this stuff. But a lot of it was just kind of ripe for the picking.
One of the things I noticed in your book was that the people who had helped you give guidance and so forth, a number of them had been speakers here before. Vicki Tongate, Dr. Countryman, and can you tell us how they helped you?
You know, as for specifics, first of all, it's been 20 years, so it's been a while. But a lot of it is, first of all, looking over the material and making sure I had a lot of it accurate. That sometimes they would offer suggestions for the directions I could potentially look, particularly those who were working in libraries such as the DeGauyer at SMU and elsewhere, saying, well, this is something that we have available, and giving suggestions in what direction to go. And then from there, a lot of times there would be references in other books that I was using that were secondary, references, just books about the situation. Then I used their notes and said, well, what documents did you use? And it kind of led me on further rabbit trails. So everybody had something to contribute to it. Obviously, no dissertation can be done solo. Anybody who says otherwise is a little more arrogant than I would prefer to be. Everybody was such a big help about this. I really appreciated it.
Well, Mary Austin Holley, I read her book. And it is, and she was very young when she wrote it. Oh, yeah. And
she was widowed very young.
And it was one of the most beautifully eloquent, articulate, cogent documents of early Texas history I've ever read. And I have since later found out that a lot of people who study natural geography of what things looked like before the encroachment of cattle and people and so forth, they used that document because she gave such vivid detail of what the flora and fauna and the fowl and so forth.
You can almost smell it, yeah. Yeah. She had quite a way with words, and you can see. I mean, when she got back and was trying, she actually wrote articles also for the Louisville newspaper that were equally eloquent about supporting the cause of Texas, but she went into such incredible detail just to make sure that she wanted to make sure people were aware of what they were getting themselves into, and at the same time to lure them closer. She paints a beautiful picture of what Texas would look like, say, in the spring or after a rainstorm or something like that. And looking at the various animals, the different flowers, and she would go into detail about what each of them looked like and where you could find them and what would grow here, what would grow there. And she, going even further than that, she went tribe by tribe. She was at least willing to recognize, and not all people were in this time period, that the different tribes were very different people. What you get from, say, the Caddo or the Tonkawa is not going to be what you get with the Comanche. She actually went as far as to say the Karankawa have a worse reputation than they actually deserve, which was pretty striking for the 1830s. But she was wanting to make sure if she's going to get that information out there, she's not going to be accused of doing anything, misspeaking in any way. It's just all part of her ultimate goal to, well, support her cousin and support the Austin colony and get more people into this land that is just so useful. It's ripe for the picking. We need to go with it.
After reading her book, I thought, wow, wish I could write like her. I mean, it was such copious detail.
Absolutely.
Okay, any questions from the audience? What I will do is come down there, or you can come down here either way. Any questions? Don't be bashful. This is your time to ask an expert.
You had mentioned before introducing her that I think in 1844 was the last conflict between the Native American tribe and the settlers.
In Allen.
In Allen, okay. Where did the Native Americans go? Were they replaced, or did they just leave?
You're asking a question that would take all night to answer, but I'm going to give it my best. Can I answer this, Dr. Caughfield?
Absolutely.
One of the startling things that the Anglo settlers found when they came into the Dallas, Collin County area was that there weren't a lot of Indians. And what the Indians there were more of a migratory nature because they were being pushed out from the East Coast and the Mississippi region, and they themselves had become immigrants to Texas. And I mean, there's a reason that they call the Alabama Coshada Alabama, because they came from Alabama. And to answer your question, about 1600 is when sometime in maybe early 1700s, sometime in the 1600s, is the last time that permanent settlements were occurred in this region. What happened to them? We don't know. Drought, famine, and so they just kind of disappeared. In fact, an archaeologist wrote a paper one time, what happened to the Indians in the Dallas area? Because what they were finding was that the Indians were here, were not permanent settlers. They're more of a, they would come in during a hunting season, or they would come in during a fishing or the deer season, whatever. But then they would go back somewhere else or go someplace else. They're more of a migratory nature. Now, that's one answer to your question. Then another answer is, most of your Comanche were from Allen to the west. The Highway 75 corridor was kind of a boundary itself. The Caddo seemed to exist from here east, and then the Comanche from here west. But those boundaries changed every decade. And it wasn't like today where we have the state of Texas boundaries looked the same as they did 150 years ago. They were constantly changing. So most likely, as Anglo settlers were moving in, the other Comanche were moving a little further west, and so forth. Now, another answer to the question, a hunter, a trapper, came into the area from here east, from here to like in the Greenville area, around 1790, 1780, somewhere in there, and found lots of Caddo. And when he came back 30 years later, they were gone. And then with further research, a lot of them were killed by disease. Flu, pneumonia, cholera, diseases such as that. Do you care to elaborate?
Just to build off of what you've already said, I mean, the Caddo in particular were fairly common in this area, I think east, northeast Texas in particular. And not only are you dealing with the question of disease, I mean, the flu is a really good example of something with which, Europeans would have immunity. A lot of the native tribes never had dealt with it, or measles,
and
or smallpox. And then on top of that, you talked about these other tribes that are coming in this time period. You have the Quapaw, the Delaware, and then you have the Cherokee. And the Cherokee, actually, by the 1820s, 1830s, were helping to push the Caddo out into kind of what's now eastern Oklahoma, just so they could have room for themselves. So it's a very complicated situation, lots and lots of moving parts. As he pointed out, there's no real solid, fixed boundary of any of this stuff.
Now, the only reason we think the Comanche when I was growing up, it was called the Muncie Massacre. We don't use that term anymore. We call it the Muncie Dispute. But
it says massacre on the historical marker on campus.
Right. But nevertheless, because we do think it's Comanche, because the only evidence of that is they took some of the children and took them further west, and they found their bodies like in the Frisco area. And so that means that whoever the raiders were heading west, which at the time was Comancheria, they called it. So, but we won't know, we don't have enough evidence to say for sure. We do have enough evidence to know that was the last known conflict in the Allen area. But that was one of the things that some of the early pioneers noted, there weren't any Indians. Now, as you go further west, that was a different story. You saw the Apache and the Comanche. But the archaeologists are currently thinking that the permanent settlers, by the way, we know a lot of Indians lived along the Rowlett Creek because we have found what we call cracked rocks. That means they were around a hearth, and as they got hot, they would explode. Evidence of a permanent civilization. We have found a lot of that up and down the Rowlett Creek. Now, that was a lengthy answer to your question. Did I answer to your question? Yes. Any other questions? We've got an expert here. This This is the time. Any other time she might charge for her advice. So go ahead and ask. Do I hear a hand? The hands over here. Don't be bashful.
What I was wondering is, what was the life expectancy among women, children during that time? Was there a lot of just, you just hear that no one lived that long. And I was just wondering, with some of these women and their families, was that just due to, the lack of medical science, or was it just due to the harshness of the environment, or the hostilities that were going on? I just was wondering, what was an average life expectancy?
In terms of life expectancy, I've not actually seen a number, but as for reasons for potentially low life expectancy, everything you mentioned would definitely be a factor into that. I do know you had all sorts of interesting epidemics that raged through Texas in the 19th century. One good example in the 1840s was yellow fever, and it hit hard. I always give my students the example of, 300 people in Corpus Christi died of yellow fever in the epidemic of that year, which doesn't sound terribly striking until you realize there were only 900 people in Corpus Christi at that point. So that wasn't that unusual. And then the case is true. I mean, you go to a cemetery around here now, and you can see a lot of the graves are children, many of whom haven't even been given a name. They were so young. The idea was you didn't name your child until they were at least a year old for a lot of families, because you might want to use that name again. So you don't want to just lose it out there. So they were very aware of death. I've mentioned that in classes before. I disturb my students. They say, "You're morbid." It's like, yeah, maybe you should be more cognizant of your mortality. They certainly were. It was something they dealt with all the time. If they had managed to survive various epidemics and everything else, you could probably, based on what I've seen in other examples, probably get to 60 or 70. But you have all the various epidemics and the hostilities and everything else, and potentially dying in childbirth. And I'd have to go into a little bit more research as to actual numbers, I'm afraid.
To add to that, childbirth was a major killer. And one major change that has occurred in the last 100 years, it used to be a man outlived his wife because of the childbirth thing, and also tuberculosis was a major killer for women. And the theory is, I can't say that I can prove it, but the theory is the women tended to be more inside and the air was contaminated, whereas the men were out in the forest and the fields where it's cleaner air. That's the current theory, but they believe that tuberculosis was a major killer of women and childbirth.
When you were talking about recruiting people to move to future Texas, talking about the fertility of the land, where was this person identifying this fertile land? Because not all of Texas is all that fertile.
Yeah, she was looking at the Austin colony. So think closer to the Gulf. So think southeastern Texas, kind of southwest of where Houston is, that region there around Brazoria and towards Matagorda Bay, and probably closer to the coastline than further inland. So thinking coastal plains. And I think that's the area she's pretty much looking at there.
Also, in the Allen area, I've looked at letters that early pioneers sent home to Kentucky and Tennessee. Get down here fast. The corn grows as tall as I am. And that, of course, that was enough to get people moving here. And the black soils of Collin County were very fertile.
Still are.
Which of the women did you spend the most time doing research on, and why?
Probably there would be two I would focus in on. One, of course, would be Mary Austin Holley because of her book. And there's a lot of material out there, actually, about Mary Austin Holley. And she had some really interesting things to say. Along with that, probably Jane Casno. Jane Casno is not as well known, but she did a lot. She came out here, actually, far as I can tell, after trying to get over a relationship with Aaron Burr, which kind of gives you an idea of the time period we're dealing with here. He was in his 70s at the time. I won't go into that. But she came out here and settled down around Eagle Pass, and she wrote about that, her experiences there with the people, what she saw in Texas. She actually served as a journalist, kind of a reporter on the scene during the Mexican War for the New York Sun. Her editor sent her there to she actually went with a couple other people, so she looked like she was with, a husband or something, even though she was not married to the person at that point. But to go and get information, he actually even sent her to go talk to Winfield Scott, who was in charge of the efforts in the Mexican War, and to talk about maybe some sort of arrangement that he had heard about, that the Mexicans were interested in kind of working out a truce, and he refused to even listen to her. Because, as he put it, he had no reason to pay any attention to, as he put it, a plenipotentiary in petticoats. But she was an interesting woman. She put herself more out there than even Mary Austin Holley would have. She did a lot of stuff by pen name. Many of the pen names were masculine, so she could actually get published, or she published anonymously, as potentially the case in the Democratic Review. But she used all sorts of different ideas and really tried to put herself out there. And so there was so much to read. It kept me busy.
The first time I ever heard of the word salubrity was when I read Mary Holly's book. I thought, what's that word mean? In fact, I was having to use the dictionary quite a bit in her book. And this is a woman who was, 21 or 22 when she wrote that? 23?
No, she was probably in her 40s. Because her children, her youngest, I think, was 18 or 19. Her daughter was already married and moved on. And she actually was living, her son stayed with her because he basically special needs. And so he stayed with her. But he was basically an adult at that point. So she was, I think, maybe early to mid 40s.
Any last minute questions, comments, criticism? This is a library, we can take it all. Did you bring any books to sell?
I should have, but I don't. I don't actually have any.
Oh.
I have mine for myself and my mother-in-law's copy, and that's pretty much it.
But you can get them on Amazon.
Yes.
And,
or through A&M. Yeah, they still sell it.
Or A&M? Mm-hmm. Any last minute comments before it's gone? The gavel's fixing to hit the podium. Thank you, Dr. Caughfield.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.